You wander through the swampy wastelands of Point Lookout, spotting something odd. It looks like a manor, which is surprisingly intact considering the amount of time that has passed since the bombs dropped. You enter the rather eerie manor, searching around for signs of life. Life that is preferably non-hostile, considering the numerous island inhabitants you have met that were not exactly social or even slightly welcoming. As you sneak around, you find an old man who requests your help. He says to you,
"Swamp folk who, I should mention, absconded with a book, a precious family heirloom. I wanted to ask you, friend, will you get it back?"
After you leave the manor on a newfound quest to help the old man be reunited with a precious family heirloom, you are stopped by a strange woman who comes running towards you. She says to you,
"I thought as much. Listen to me very carefully, child. You mustn't bring it to him."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Fallout 3 DLC, Point Lookout. More specifically, the quest, The Dark Heart of Blackhall. We're going to try to decide who gets the book. To decide this, we will have to discuss a few things. The book's history and purpose, who else has had the book, why does Obadiah Blackhall even want the book back, and why does Marcella want the book instead. So let's start with explaining a little about the purpose of the book and its backstory. So what actually is the history and purpose of this book? Is also known as the Krivbeknih. It is linked to an obelisk known as Queltoth, linked to a supposed eldritch god or supernatural being of the same name. The obelisk is found under the Dunwich building. Building wasn't constructed over this ancient stone by accident. No, the Dunwich brothers, along with their sister, Constance Blackhall, were rather passionate about the occult. This building essentially would serve as a front for their occult dealings, hiding the obelisk that was used to worship the entity. Essentially, the Krivbeknih is the companion book for this obelisk and shrine. This book was once owned by Constance Blackhall, Obadiah's ancestor, which is why he claims the ownership over the book. However, this is no innocent diary where she wrote about her life and darkest secrets. No, that would be a decision that would be too easy. This book instead was the book that Constance used both before and after the war for her occult activities, using it to become a sort of priestess or cult leader and lead her followers and the swamp folk after the war. Her possession of the book would lead to her unnaturally long lifespan. Her ministering to the swamp folk would influence their culture after the war. However, Constance would pass after the book was stolen, and after she lost her influence over the swamp folk. Over the years since Constance's death, the swamp folk in Point Lookout would continue to use the Krivbeknih and the rituals taught to them by Constance, these being passed down through generations. However, as the years went on, these would become ramblings, with much of the meaning disappearing due to the severe radiation and inbreeding faced by the swamp folk. They did still worship Queltoth, however. Much of the original thought behind the worship and beliefs behind it would be somewhat lost to them, whereas the Blackhalls would remember and continue their own version of the practice. This book being used in ritual worship of Queltoth, which is a potentially dangerous supernatural entity, hints at why someone may want to steal it. Now that we know what the Krivbeknih was used for, we should discuss who stole the book and why they specifically did this. The Krivbeknih has changed hands several times, both pre-war and post-wars, but who has held possession of this book after the war is one of the more interesting aspects of the quest, especially with what it may have done to those who had it in their possession. The Krivbeknih was initially stolen by the swamp folk, who were part of the cult led by Constance Blackhall. This was to both take away her power over them. As previously noted, the swamp folk, even without the years of radiation and inbreeding, were not exactly kind to outsiders and did not want to work with them. They had, at one point prior to the bombs dropping, attacked a volunteer aid worker and 2 military officers who were stationed on the island. The swamp folk wanted the book so they could perform their rituals, which we see evidence of these rituals at the ritual site. However, they were not the only ones to come into possession of the book since the death of Constance Blackhall. There have been others who have held onto the book since her death. The most notable is an unnamed ranger and his son, Jamie Palabras. The ranger acquired the book around the 2250s on an expedition. he did not know what this book actually was, except for the fact it was an old world book and potentially valuable. He and Jamie would set out to the capital wastelands in an attempt to sell the book, seeing if the Brotherhood of Steel scribes that were in the capital were interested in it. However, they were not. With this failing to sell the book, the Ranger would of course change course, attempting to return the book from whence it came. Potentially knowing the dangers of this text, he would abandon his son Jamie whilst he slept in an old hospital while he followed the trail for where to take the book. Abandoning children in a wasteland. Sounds familiar. Jamie, however, would not see this as a reason to go back home and instead would look for his father. This was not without its own problems. He did fall in with the wrong crowd for a little while, spending some time with raiders, who, well, horrified him. He would eventually betray the raiders with the help of traders who would point him in the right direction of his father. Cursed Dunwich building. Eventually, after some time, Jamie would make it to the building and would find his father. However, he was no longer his father that had walked the wastelands with him. No, instead, he had become a feral ghoul. Jamie would find the book on him, which is really the only reason he was able to recognize him. Jamie took the book as a memento, a reminder of who his father once was. With the long journey behind him and another one ahead of him, he would sit down and rest against a strange stone, Ug Queltoth. This rest being a fatal mistake. Well, sort of, considering he was still technically alive, just ghoulified and insane, when you, the lone wanderer, eventually find him, without the book. If Jamie lost the book, who else would have it? Well, not much else is known about the book's ownership and whose minds it may have tormented before it would end up back at Point Lookout, with the swamp folk, who would eventually end up with the book back in their possession. But why did they care so much for this book? Well, the book is used during their rituals, in which they sacrifice others and essentially torture them to death. We can see that the last sacrifice had their life prolonged during the torture due to the stimpaks surrounding them. We see this with how mutilated the body is, along with the ceremonial knife being impaled in the sacrifice's head. The human sacrifice is not the only feature in this. The Krivbeknih is also here in what used to be a holy water font. Considering the importance of the book to them, this likely means, like their ancestors under the guidance of the Blackhalls, the current swamp folk of Point Lookout are still worshipping Og Queltoth, trying to awaken their god of sorts through the sacrifices, rituals, and worshipping, which is why they wanted the book back. Let's checkpoint this. Based on the appearance of the skeleton, and also the aggression to those who are not their kind, it seems as if this was not a willing sacrifice, likely someone they may have taken. This suggests that the swamp folk should not be left with the book, as they would continue their aggression and repeated attempts to summon Ug Queltoth. But it does bring to mind whether or not the book should be given back to Obadiah Blackhall, considering it is, after all, his family heirloom. Well, if you look at what the book was used for, as well as what the Ug Queltoth obelisk has done to people, considering it corrupted and transformed both Jamie and his father, and it led to the violent rituals of the swamp folk, suggesting that this book should not be in the hands of those who do not know or understand its power. Obadiah, being the old man who essentially born into that family legacy, knows all about what that book represents, so he should theoretically be able to control it, rather than letting it control him. So based on this, he should get the book back. But why is this book so important to him? Considering, like most antiques and heirlooms, these things change hands and go through many different families, most losing the original meaning. Considering this, we should discuss why the Krivbeknih is even that important to Obadiah Blackhall. Well, this book in part was at one point property of his great-great-great-grandmother, Constance Blackhall. She came into possession of it after 2058 due to her coming into wealth from the death of her husband. She, at this time, spent much of her fortune purchasing occult items, including the Krivbeknih. This book gave her and her family influence over the swamp folk on Point Lookout, having them as members of her cult. With this cult came power for the family both before and after the war. However, as we can see with Obadiah, the power and influence that once was in his family no longer remained with the disappearance of the book. Obadiah, like his ancestors, still worship Og Queltoth. We see this with the secret altar in his manor house, along with the dead creeper sacrificed to this entity. He, like the swamp folk, was attempting to appease and release Og Queltoth into the wastelands, however, without the book in his possession. Obadiah sees the swamp folk as unintelligent, uncivilized, and of course inbred, most likely due to the theft of the Krivbeknih all those years ago. The issues with the swamp folk are due to several things. The inbreeding, of course, being one, the radiation another, and the new plague. We see mentions of this infection spreading on the island in the terminals in the former medical tents. This would potentially explain some of the strange appearances seen in the swamp folk. If you'd like me to do a video on the diseases of Fallout, let me know in the comments. So let's checkpoint this. Obadiah wants the influence over the swamp folk that this book would bring. He sees this as part of his family's legacy. Considering that he is the last of the Blackhall line, he desires to restore the balance that he feels was tipped when the book was taken from his ancestor Constance Blackhall. He wishes to reinstate the cult his great-great-great-grandmother once had on the island. If he was to get his wish, this would mean there would be more sacrifices as part of the rituals to Og-Qualtoth. Considering his general disdain for most people, this would leave almost anyone open to being his target. So because of this, you should not give Obadiah the book back. Now we should discuss Marcella's side of the story. After all, she is the one who does not want him to have the book back anyway. But why does Marcella want the book destroyed instead of returned? Well, Marcella has her own past involving the occult. However, in a rather different sense to the Blackhalls. Marcella is a nomadic Christian missionary who was raised at the Abbey of the Road. Here she learned about various other religions and occult practices, which is how she is able to identify the icons within the ritualistic figures you see around the island that make up the religion of the swamp folk. She has previously interacted with Obadiah, who attempted to manipulate her into returning the Krivbeknih, claiming it as more of a harmless heirloom than anything else. With Marcella finding out that this was indeed a much more sinister book, she realized the severity of the issue, stating that the book must be destroyed, and highlighting that he must not be trusted. She would understand that he had the intentions to use this book for the religion that his ancestors started on the island, and with her knowledge of the occult, understood that Og-Qualtoth was a dangerous entity to be messing with. However, Marcella's passion for a more biblical god and the destruction of the Krivbeknih would lead to her own destruction, with her death being as a result of the smugglers being hired as mercenaries to kill her, this being in an attempt to take her out of the race for the Krivbeknih. It is heavily suggested that these mercenaries were no robbery gone wrong, but instead it would be Obadiah attempting to prevent her from destroying the book, as without the book, he would not be able to regain the influence his family once had over the swamp folk. Marcella sees the book as a dark text, an occult book, after all that's what it is, which its mere existence is a danger to not only those in Point Lookout, but perhaps the outside wastelands, having previously learnt about it in the Abbey, hinting that she knows more about Og-Qualtoth than she tells you. So let's checkpoint this. Should you follow Marcella's request to destroy the Krivbeknih? Marcella's desire to help and minister to those who she feels are less fortunate are what led her to Point Lookout. However, it would be her that would become the unfortunate one, becoming another victim of the cult that the Blackhalls had started prior to the war. Not as a sacrifice, but instead her death being seen as a means to an end. With her death, the book was expected to fall back into the hands of the Blackhall family, highlighting the ruthlessness and the violence that Obadiah was willing to resort to just to get the Krivbeknih back into his own hands. This hints at exactly why this book is so dangerous. If he was simply willing to have someone killed over the book, what else would he do for it? The book, in not only his hands but the hands of others, has led to many deaths, as well as others becoming transformed into crazed ghouls. So the Krivbeknih ruins the lives of those it touches, and causes further suffering for unsuspecting victims, whether they be unwilling sacrifices or future ghouls. So because of this, the book should be destroyed. So now we should decide, who actually deserves the book? Although it is Obadiah's family heirloom, the Krivbeknih is not a trinket to be trifled with. Considering its history being used as a means of cult worship in both the Blackhall family and the swamp folk suggests that this book is rather problematic. Not only this, but Obadiah wishes to restore his family's rule over the swamp folk through the possession of the book, so much that he is willing to have people killed for it, whereas Marcella wishes to end the suffering and destruction caused by the book, which is why the book should be destroyed, as she advised. So let me know in the comments who you think deserves the book. If you enjoyed this video, then you will enjoy this one. It is about who really is the supervillain of the Superhuman Gambit Fallout 3 side quest, going over their tragic past and their current actions to decide who is good and who is evil.